In 1987, a young designer at a failing Japanese software company sat down to make what he privately believed would be the last game of his career. He wasn't being dramatic. He meant it literally. If this game didn't sell, he was leaving the games industry and returning to university to finish a degree he'd abandoned 4 years earlier. He would have had to repeat a year. He would have had no friends there. He later recalled it in his mind. The word final in the title wasn't just poetic, it was a precise description of what he was facing. The company was nearly out of money. His colleagues didn't believe in the project. Only 3 people volunteered to work on it. He named the game Final Fantasy. It didn't fail, and in the decade that followed, the franchise he built by accident became one of the most important in the history of video games, evolving with each new entry into something its predecessor hadn't been, advancing what stories video games could tell, what systems they could build, and finally, in 1997, what audiences they could reach, before the very person who created it made a decision that would end his career at a company he'd saved. This is part 1, from the Powerline Company's hairdresser salon in 1983 to a mercenary standing at the edge of a city powered by the planet's blood in 1997. To understand Final Fantasy, you have to first understand Square, a company that existed because a young man didn't want to work in the powerline business. In September 1983, Masafumi Miyamoto graduated from Waseda University in Tokyo and went to work for his father. His father, Kunichi Miyamoto, ran Tenyu Sha, a powerline construction firm based in Yokohama. The company built things that kept electricity moving. Masafumi wanted to make something else entirely. He established a software development division inside Tenyu Sha. The original offices were set up in a former hairdresser salon. The company's name, Square, was a reference to a golfing term for facing challenges directly, and to a town square as a place of cooperation. While Japanese game development at the time was typically conducted by a single programmer doing everything alone, Miyamoto believed you needed graphic designers, programmers and story writers working together to keep up with advances in the medium. He hired teams rather than individuals. Among his earliest hires were 2 university dropouts, Hironobu Sakaguchi and Hiromichi Tanaka, who joined as part-time employees in 1983. Sakaguchi had been studying electrical engineering at Yokohama National University when he walked away to make games. Square's first titles, The Death Trap and its sequel, Will the Death Trap 2, both designed by Sakaguchi for personal computers, were modest adventure games. Capable, not remarkable. When Nintendo's Famicom console began dominating the Japanese market, Square followed the audience onto consoles. In September 1986, Miyamoto made the company formally independent, spinning the software division out from Tenyu Sha and incorporating it as Square Co. Ltd, with initial capital of 10 million yen and a staff drawn from the predecessor operation. Sakaguchi was appointed Director of Planning and Development. What happened next defined the terms of a crisis. Square released a series of games for Nintendo's Famicom Disk System, a peripheral for floppy disk-based software. The peripheral underperformed in the market. Square's Famicom Disk System titles, several of them, were commercial failures. The bank providing Square's development loans, Shikoku Bank, had sent a representative to oversee operations. By 1987, Square was in serious financial difficulty, with enough resources remaining to make approximately 1 more game. Miyamoto asked the company's 4 directors to each submit a game proposal. Staff would vote on the best. Sakaguchi submitted a proposal for a role-playing game. He had wanted to make one for years. Every time he raised it, Square had refused on commercial grounds. The assumption was that RPGs were niche, difficult, unlikely to sell in volume. Then in 1986, Enix published Dragon Quest on the Famicom. It sold 1.5 million copies in Japan. The genre Sakaguchi had been told was commercially unviable had just become one of the most commercially viable things in Japanese gaming. Square reconsidered. Sakaguchi's proposal was approved. He assembled a team. Only 3 colleagues volunteered to join the project. His reputation within Square as a difficult boss, demanding, exacting, not given to praise, meant most of the company preferred to work elsewhere. The game Sakaguchi designed drew direct inspiration from 3 existing works: Enix Dragon Quest for turn-based combat and level progression, Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda for top-down world exploration, and Origin Systems' Ultima series for world building depth and scale. The scenario was written by freelance writer Kenji Terada from Sakaguchi's original story. Composer Nobuo Uematsu, who had worked with Sakaguchi on several previous Square projects, wrote the music. This was his 16th video game composition, and nothing that had come before suggested what he would become. Yoshitaka Amano was hired as character designer. He was initially unknown to Sakaguchi until a colleague pointed out that the illustration style Sakaguchi was already looking for in magazine clippings was in fact Amano's existing work. Programmer Nasir Gebelli, an Iranian-American developer with extensive experience in the American games industry, wrote the code and added something nobody asked for: a sliding title puzzle hidden inside the game, which became the first RPG minigame ever created. The game was originally to be called Fighting Fantasy. A trademark conflict with an existing British gamebook series forced a name change. The team needed a title that could still be abbreviated FF in both Latin script and Japanese. They settled for Final Fantasy. The name's meaning has been contested ever since. In a 2015 interview, Sakaguchi clarified that the name primarily reflected his own personal situation. If the game failed, he was leaving the industry and completing his degree. Square's genuine financial precariousness at the time gave the name additional resonance. But it was Sakaguchi's private professional crisis that gave it its truest weight. He later said it reflected my emotional state at the time and the feeling that time had stopped. Final Fantasy launched in Japan on December 18, 1987. Initial plans had called for a print run of 200,000 copies, a modest, cautious number. Sakaguchi personally lobbied Square's management for a larger run that could generate enough momentum to found a sequel, and they agreed to 400,000, which sold out. The final shipped total in Japan was 520,000 copies. The game reversed Square's financial decline and became the company's flagship product. Sakaguchi did not go back to university. Before the franchise is a franchise, there is a single game, and understanding what that game actually was, what it asked players to do and feel, matters as much as knowing that it saved its creator's career. Final Fantasy on the NES was, by design, an experience built around player authorship. The game had a story. 4 young warriors, called the Warriors of Light, each carrying a darkened crystal orb, arrive at a kingdom and set out to restore light to 4 elemental crystals: earth, fire, water and wind, that have been corrupted by 4 demonic creatures called the 4 Fiends. The world is in decay. Monsters roam freely. The land is dying. The Warriors of Light are the prophecy's answer. It sounds archetypal, and it was. Deliberately so. Sakaguchi drew the structure wholesale from Dungeons & Dragons and the Western fantasy tradition it had codified. But what distinguished Final Fantasy from Dragon Quest, its immediate commercial inspiration, was that the Warriors of Light had no individual personalities. No predetermined names, no defined backstories. They were blank slates, defined entirely by the choices the player made before the game began. At the start, the player chose 4 characters from 6 available classes: Fighter, Thief, Monk, Red Mage, White Mage, and Black Mage. The Fighter could wield heavy weapons and armor, the party's physical anchor. The Thief was fast and evasive. The Monk fought best barehanded, doing enormous damage without needing expensive equipment. The White Mage cast healing and protective spells. The Black Mage cast offensive magic: fire, ice, thunder. The Red Mage was a hybrid who could do both, but never as powerfully as the dedicated specialists. Each combination produced a meaningfully different game. A party of 4 Black Mages could glass cannon through most of the early game, but collapse against enemies with magical resistance. A party of 4 Monks, counterintuitively, could become nearly unbeatable by the late game, their barehanded damage exceeding any weapon in the game at high levels. The balanced party of Fighter, White Mage, Black Mage and Red Mage was safe but slower to develop. Every choice had consequences that propagated across 60 to 80 hours of play. Midway through the game, characters underwent a class change. A quest rewarded by the Dragon King Bahamut that promoted each warrior into a more powerful form. Fighters became knights, able to cast basic white magic. Thieves became ninjas, faster and able to wield nearly any weapon. Monks became masters, pure physical power. White mages became white wizards. Black mages became black wizards with access to the game's most powerful spells. Red mages became red wizards, their hybrid status allowing them access to more powerful magic from both schools than before, though still short of the specialties. The story's final twist, revealed in the game's closing act, was a temporal loop. The 4 fans, it emerged, had been sent 2000 years into the future by a dark knight named Garland, who had himself been sent 2000 years into the past by the 4 fans. The warriors who defeated Garland at the game's opening encounter him again as the final boss, transformed into the demon Chaos, the originator of the entire cycle, who has been feeding power through time in a self-sustaining loop of destruction. The warriors of light break the loop by defeating Chaos in the past, erasing the original corruption and restoring the crystals. For 1987, this was sophisticated narrative architecture. The time loop twist did not read as deep character drama. The warriors of light remained blank slates throughout, but it demonstrated that Sakaguchi was thinking about story structure in ways that most game developers weren't. The puzzle-like elegance of the paradox, the revelation that the first enemy and the final enemy were the same entity feeding each other across time, was a signal of what the franchise would eventually become. The game was not without its significant rough edges. Spell charges, the game's resource for magic use, did not regenerate between dungeon floors without camping supplies, making resource management a constant pressure in longer dungeons. Enemy encounters occurred randomly as players moved through overworld and dungeon maps, triggering at a frequency that made grinding feel mechanical. Navigation without a consistent map required either memorization or documentation. The game was hard in ways that were partly intentional and partly accidental, a result of limited development time rather than deliberately calibrated difficulty design. But none of that diminished what the original Final Fantasy established: that a role-playing game could be designed around the player's identity rather than a protagonist. That the person holding the controller could project themselves into a story about saving a dying world by making choices that felt genuinely theirs. Dragon Quest had given players a single hero with a predetermined role. Final Fantasy gave players a party that they had built themselves. That distinction mattered, and it would carry forward, transformed, refined and eventually completely reinvented, across every entry that followed. The original Final Fantasy was successful enough to demand a sequel. What Sakaguchi did with that mandate is one of the most radical decisions in the franchise history, and he made it twice in a row. Final Fantasy II launched in Japan in December 1988. It retained almost nothing from its predecessor. The Warriors of Light were gone. The crystal structure was gone. The job classes were gone. The experience point system was gone. In their place was something the Japanese games industry had rarely seen. A story-driven RPG with pre-written characters who had names, personalities, relationships and arcs that the player had no hand in defining. The protagonist was Firion, a young man whose hometown of Fynn is attacked and destroyed by the forces of the Palamecian Empire at the game's opening. Firion, his childhood friends Maria and Guy, and Maria's brother Leon are left for dead by Imperial soldiers. Resistance fighters find them and bring them back. Firion and his companions join the Wild Rose Rebellion, a resistance movement led by Princess Hilda, against the Emperor of Palamecia, a sorcerer who has literally made a pact with demonic forces and is using monsters summoned from hell itself to conquer the world. The story introduced several elements that would become permanent franchise fixtures. A character named Sid, a brilliant engineer who appeared as an ally, the Chocobo, a large, rideable bird that would become Final Fantasy's most recognizable creature outside its human characters. Guest characters who joined the party for specific story segments before being separated from it, often through sacrifice. Joseph, a miner who helps the party recover the war materials the rebellion needs, gives his life holding back a boulder so the others can escape. Minwu, a white mage serving Princess Hilda, sacrifices himself to break the magical seal on the game's most powerful spell. Rickard, the last of the legendary dragoons, holds back the resurrected emperor so the others can flee. Final Fantasy II was built around the idea that war cost lives, and it wanted the player to feel each death. The mechanical system Akitoshi Kawasu designed for Final Fantasy II, later described as one of the most controversial designs in the franchise, eliminated experience points entirely. Characters improved through use. Firion's strength increased if he attacked frequently in battle. Maria's magic improved if she cast spells. Guy's defense improved if he took damage. Equipment proficiency increased the more a character used specific weapon types. The system was deeply flexible. Any character could theoretically become any kind of fighter, but also deeply gameable in ways that undermined its own intentions, since players could simply hit their own party members to raise HP, a notorious edge case that became one of the game's most remembered quirks. The result was criticized within Square itself. According to the game's own Wikipedia documentation, the usage-based growth system received negative feedback from Square staff outside of Kawasu, and Final Fantasy III directly reverted to the more traditional systems of the original game. But Final Fantasy's II story ambition, named characters, personal arcs, sacrifice, political conflict, permanently changed what the franchise expected of its narrative. Every Final Fantasy after it told stories about people rather than types. That shift started here. Final Fantasy III launched in Japan in April 1990. It returned to job classes, expanded them, and added a critical piece of mechanical logic the original had only gestured at: the ability to change jobs during the game rather than only at creation. For orphan children, simply called Warriors of Light, discover they have been chosen by elemental crystals to save a world in which the balance between light and dark has been disrupted. As the party explores and defeats bosses tied to each crystal, they unlock new job classes to add to their available roster, eventually accessing 23 different jobs that could be changed between battles at any time. The system was a direct ancestor of Final Fantasy V more fully realized version, and established that character class flexibility, the ability to experiment, change course and adapt, was a core piece of what Final Fantasy's combat should feel like. Neither Final Fantasy II nor Final Fantasy III were released outside Japan during the NES era. When the franchise eventually reached North America on the Super Nintendo, Final Fantasy IV was relabeled as Final Fantasy II, and Final Fantasy VI was relabeled as Final Fantasy III, skipping two entire entries that Western audiences would not officially encounter until much later. This created a persistent confusion about the franchise's numbering that lasted for years, and meant that many players who thought of themselves as Final Fantasy veterans had in fact never played the games that established its most important mechanical and narrative foundations. Everything changed in July 1991, when Final Fantasy IV launched for the Super Famicom. The hardware was fundamentally different from the NES. More processing power, better sound, significantly improved graphics, and the Mode 7 graphical technique that allowed the game's world map to appear to rotate as players traversed it, lending the overworld a sense of genuine three-dimensionality that the NES couldn't approach. But the hardware was only part of what made Final Fantasy IV a turning point. The other part was what Sakaguchi and his team decided to do with the story. Cecil Harvey is a Dark Knight, a warrior who channels darkness itself as a weapon, who has built his entire identity around loyal military service to the King of Baron. He is the captain of the Red Wings, Baron's elite airship fleet. The game opens with Cecil leading a raid on the town of Mysidia to steal its elemental crystal for Baron's increasingly erratic king. The mission succeeds. Cecil's crew kills civilians in the process. Cecil, flying back, is disturbed by what he has participated in. He says so to the king directly. He is stripped of his command, demoted from captain, and sent on a delivery mission with his childhood friend Kain Highwind, a dragoon. The delivery turns out to be a bomb. The package they carry is designed to destroy the village of Mist. It does. The village burns. The sole survival is a young girl named Rydia, a summoner of monsters, the daughter of a conjurer whose dead they have just cast. She summons an earthquake in her grief. Kain is lost in the chaos. Cecil, stricken, picks up the wounded child and carries her to safety. This is the game's first hour. The protagonist has already been established as someone who has done terrible things in service to authority, who questioned that authority and who is now wandering without it, carrying the literal consequence of his obedience in his arms. Final Fantasy IV's central narrative question, the one that drives its entire story, is what a person does when the identity they've built around turns out to have been built on something wrong. Cecil was a Dark Knight. He was good at it. He served faithfully, and his faithful service produced burned villages and dead civilians. The game does not let him off the hook for that. The path forward requires Cecil to become a different kind of person entirely. Midway through the game, he climbs a mountain called Empty Ordeals and faces a trial, not of combat, but of identity. A manifestation of his own darkness confronts him, wearing his own face. The only way to defeat it is not to raise his sword against it, but to refuse to fight it, to choose not to be what it represents. When he does, he transforms. The Dark Knight becomes a paladin, a warrior who fights not from darkness but from light, a protector rather than a conqueror. His attack power decreases when this happens. The game is explicit about this. The paladin is physically weaker than the Dark Knight in the short term. The point is not tactical, it is thematic. Becoming a better person costs something. Brute strength alone isn't power, the game says, through its mechanics as much as its text. Final Fantasy IV also introduced the active time battle system, designed by Hiroyuki Ito. Previous Final Fantasy games had been turn-based in the classical sense. Both sides waited, took a turn, waited again. The ATB system replaced that with cogs that filled in real time for every character and every enemy simultaneously. When a gog filled, that character or enemy could act. Players could not spend unlimited time deciding. The pressure continued whether they chose or not. Combat became something you managed and responded to, rather than something you took deliberate turns at. The full cast of Final Fantasy IV, 12 playable characters including Cecil, Kain, Rosa, a white mage and Cecil's childhood friend and romantic interest, Rydia, the engineer Sid, the young mage twins Palom and Porom, who literally petrify themselves to save the party and cannot be restored, the samurai warrior Cheng, the bard Edward, and others, gave the game a sensible feeling that earlier Final Fantasy games hadn't attempted. Characters joined and left the party based on story logic rather than player choice, and their arrivals and departures were narrative events rather than menu items. Final Fantasy IV sold approximately 3.5 million copies across all its releases. It fundamentally changed what players expected of RPG storytelling. Final Fantasy V launched for the Super Famicom in Japan in December 1992. It did not reach North America until years later. A commercial misjudgment Square would eventually regret. But in Japan, it delivered a mechanical system so well realized that its influence extended far beyond its own sales figures. The job system of Final Fantasy V is, many players and designers argue, the finest expression of character customization the franchise ever produced. The story follows Bartz, a wandering young man traveling with his chocobo, who is drawn into a conflict involving elemental crystals that sustain the planet's winds, water, fire, and earth. The crystals are shattering. Each time one breaks, it releases its power as a set of unlockable job classes. By the end of the game, if players have pursued them all, each of their 4 party members can be assigned any of 22 distinct job classes and switch between them freely between battles. The 22 jobs included Knight, Monk, Thief, White Mage, Black Mage, Red Mage, Blue Mage, TIE Mage, Summoner, Berserker, Ranger, Samurai, Dragoon, Ninja, Dancer, Bard, Geomancer, Mystic Knight, Chemist, Mime, and the rare and powerful Freelancer and Bear classes. What made the system exceptional was not the number of options. It was the ability to carry abilities across class changes. A character who had mastered the White Mage class could switch to Knight and retain the ability to cast White Magic. A samurai who had leveled the Blue Mage could absorb monster abilities while wearing heavy armor. A berserker, who attacked automatically and couldn't be directly commanded, could be paired with the Time Mage's haste ability to attack at blinding speed without the player needing to command it. Players could spend hours theory crafting combinations and then test them in actual combat. The story of Final Fantasy V was lighter and warmer in tone than Final Fantasy's 4 Moral Gravity. Bartz and his companions Lena, Galuf, Ferris, and eventually Kryl were designed as adventurers whose camaraderie was the emotional core rather than the dark internal struggle of a Cecil Harvey. The game's villain, the sorcerer ex-Death, sought to destroy everything and return all of creation to the void. A nihilistic motivation rendered in relatively straightforward terms. Where Final Fantasy IV had been about what a character had to give up to become who they needed to be, Final Fantasy V was about the pleasure of becoming whatever you chose. For a generation of players in Japan in 1992, that pleasure was the point. The game sold approximately 2.9 million copies. Its mechanical DNA would appear in countless subsequent RPGs, and the series itself would return to its job system multiple times in Final Fantasy XI, Final Fantasy XIV, among others, because the appeal of the original design never fully faded. Final Fantasy VI launched in Japan in April 1994. It was the last Final Fantasy game made for the Super Nintendo, and it arrived as something that had earned the word masterpiece genuinely rather than reflexively. The setting was unlike any Final Fantasy before it. A steampunk world, roughly equivalent in technology to the Industrial Revolution. in which magic has been almost entirely eradicated for 1,000 years following a catastrophic war called the War of the Magi. A militaristic nation called the Castilian Empire has been harvesting the remnants of that magical age. Beings called espers, magical creatures of enormous power, and experimenting on them to create Magitek soldiers, magical weapons, and eventually soldiers who can use magic themselves. The opening sequence presents the player with 3 figures in Magitek armor, marching through a blizzard toward a mining town called Narsh, where a frozen esper has been discovered. One of the 3 figures, the one in the center, is a woman who is being controlled against her will by a device called a slave crown fitted to her head. She burns through the town's defenders with magical fire. The defense mechanisms kill her 2 companions. She collapses. She wakes up in a house, her slave crown destroyed, and has no idea who she is. Her name, a rebel named Arvis tells her, is Terra. This is the opening of the most ensemble-driven Final Fantasy ever made. Where previous entries had built their cast around a single moral center, Cecil, Bards, Final Fantasy VI distributed its emotional weight across 14 playable characters, each with a specific history and a specific place in the story the game was telling. Terra Branford, the half-human, half-esper who can use magic naturally, something no human has been able to do for a millennium, carries the game's central thematic question. What does it mean to be something the world hasn't supposed to contain? What does it feel like to be afraid of your own power in a world that wants to use that power as a weapon? Locke Cole, a treasure hunter who calls himself a treasure hunter because he can't admit he's a thief, a distinction he insists on because the person whose trust he failed was stolen from him, not his to take. Celeste Shear, a former Imperial general who was infused with Magitek against her will and defected to the Resistance, who spends the whole game proving her loyalty against the suspicion she will never fully escape. Edgar Roni Figaro, King of Figaro Castle, whose entire public persona as a charming womanizer is a performance he maintains to protect the grief that replaced his mother's love of machines. Sabine Reni Figaro, Edgar's twin, who walked away from a throne and spent years becoming a martial artist in the mountains because he could not watch his brother carry the weight of duty alone. Cyan Garamonde, a samurai of Doma whose family, wife and son were killed when the Castilian Empire's general Kefka Palazzo poisoned Doma's water supply during a siege, purely out of impatience. Kefka Palazzo, the villain, introduced as the general of the Empire, white-faced and laughing, who had been the first human to undergo Magitek infusion to gain magical ability, a process that was not yet perfected and destroyed his mind in the process. Kefka is not a distant, imposing evil. He is present throughout the game, cheerful, sadistic, performing his cruelty with an entertainer's energy, as if hurting people is a form of art he's especially pleased with. He poisons a kingdom's water supply and laughs about it. He burns a city out of mild irritation. He murders a general who tries to stop him and does so with apparent delight. And then, at the midpoint of the game, Kefka wins. The party fails to stop him. Kefka gains control of 3 entities of cosmic power, the Warring Triad, and moves them out of alignment, disrupting the magical balance that holds the world together. The world breaks apart, continents shift, cities sink or are swallowed, the sky turns orange and terrible. A year passes. The game's second half begins with Celeste waking up alone on a small island. The old man who had been nursing her back to health has died. There is no immediate threat, no enemy to fight, no objective listed. The island is quiet. The game sits with her in that quiet for a long deliberate time. Celeste finds him, finds a note he has left, finds a seagull with a bandage on its leg. A seagull she recognizes, which tells her that someone somewhere is still alive. She repairs a raft and leaves. It is one of the most remarkable 5 minutes in the history of the medium. Nothing happens in the conventional sense, and it is devastating. The second half of Final Fantasy VI is about whether there is any reason to fight when everything has already been lost. Each playable character must be found and re-recruited across a broken, half-destroyed world. Each has been trying to survive in their own way. Celes holds the broken party together through force of will and grief and purpose. The game earns its final act, the assault on Kefka's tower. Not through spectacle, but through the cumulative weight of everyone who chose to show up despite having every reason not to. The opera scene, earlier in the game, was the piece of it that most announced Final Fantasy VI ambitions. The party needs to recruit Setzer, a gambler who owns the world's only airship, and the only way to reach him is through the opera house, where he is planning to abduct the famous soprano Maria. Celes must impersonate Maria on stage to draw Setzer out. She performs an aria di mezzo carattere, composed by Nobuo Uematsu within the constraints of the Super Nintendo's sound chip, while the player inputs her lyrics at key moments to maintain the performance. No video game had ever done anything like it. The Super Nintendo could not produce a real soprano voice. What Uematsu did with its sound chip approximated one. A melody of such clarity and longing that it was clear he understood exactly what he was attempting. The opera scene wasn't just a narrative set piece. It was an argument, made through gameplay, that video games could do what opera does. Use music not as background decoration, but as the emotional thing itself. Final Fantasy VI sold approximately 3.4 million copies on the original SNES release and approximately 3.8 million across all versions. For many players who grew up with it, it remains the definitive expression of what the franchise was capable of on two-dimensional hardware. It pushed the Super Nintendo to its technical limits in service of telling a story about grief, complicity, and the possibility of meaning after catastrophe. It was the last Final Fantasy game that would ever be made for a Nintendo console for a very long time. Square had built its entire identity on Nintendo hardware. Every commercially successful game the company had ever made had launched on a Nintendo system. The relationship was foundational. In 1995, Square began development on Final Fantasy VII, initially assuming it would launch on the Nintendo 64. The team began exploring what the game would require. They had been experimenting with three-dimensional graphics using a software tool called Softimage, and created a technical demo featuring characters from Final Fantasy VI rendered in full 3D. What they saw was revelatory and also logistically alarming. The cinematic 3-disc storytelling they were envisioning, full motion video sequences, pre-rendered backgrounds with 3D character models overlaid, an orchestrated score, voice acting in the Japanese version, required enormous amounts of data. Estimates calculated that Final Fantasy VII, as conceived, would need approximately 30 Nintendo 64 TD discs to hold its content using available data compression. Nintendo's cartridge media was expensive to manufacture and limited in capacity. The game they were imagining could not practically exist on Nintendo's hardware. Sony's PlayStation used CD-ROM media. A CD-ROM held vastly more data than a cartridge at a fraction of the manufacturing cost. The mathematical comparison was not subtle. In 1996, Square moved all their planned projects to the PlayStation. The Nintendo relationship, built over a decade across 4 hardware generations, across every game that had made Square what it was, ended with a cost estimate. For Nintendo, the consequences were severe and lasting. Final Fantasy had been a system-selling franchise on every Nintendo console it appeared on. Metal Gear Solid made the same platform switch around the same time. The Nintendo 64 launched in 1996, facing a library gap in the RPG genre that it would never recover from. And the gap wasn't incidental. It was the direct result of the cartridge decision. For Square, the move was commercially vindicated within months of the game's release. Development on Final Fantasy VII was unlike anything Square had previously attempted. The budget was $45 million in development cost alone, the most expensive video game ever made at that point, with an additional $100 million in marketing, bringing the total to $145 million. The game would ship on 3 PlayStation discs. Sakaguchi stepped into an executive producer role. Yoshinori Kitase took the directorial seat. Tetsuya Nomura, a young designer who had worked on previous Final Fantasy entries, designed the main characters, including Cloud Strike's spiky blonde hair and enormous sword, 2 visual choices that would become among the most recognizable images in the history of the medium. Nobuo Uematsu returned to compose. The world of Final Fantasy VII was unlike any in the franchise's history. Where earlier games had taken place in high fantasy medieval settings, Final Fantasy VII opened in Midgar, a vast industrial city built on a raised steel plate above a network of slums, powered by Mako energy, a substance extracted from the planet's core that the game establishes as something genuinely sacred. The compressed life essence of all living things that have died and returned to the Earth, the planet's own circulatory system. The Shinra Electric Power Company owns the Mako reactors. Shinra owns Midgar. Shinra's energy extraction is slowly draining the planet's life force. The planet is dying of a kind of planetary capitalism, and most of its population is either employed by the entity killing it or too poor to think about anything else. The game begins with an act of eco-terrorism. Cloud Strife, a mercenary who presents himself as a former member of Shinra's elite military unit, Soldier, has been hired by Avalanche, a small group of anti-Shinra rebels led by Barret Wallace, a powerful built man with a gun crafted to his arm, to help blow up a Mako reactor on the edge of Midgar's lowest sector. Cloud is not ideologically aligned with Avalanche's mission. He takes the job for money. He collects payment when it's done and tries to leave. The game doesn't let him. Cloud meets Aerith Gainsborough, a young woman who sells flowers in a city where almost nothing grows. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, she is warm, irreverent and persistently cheerful in a place designed to extinguish cheerfulness. She is also, as the game gradually reveals, one of the last surviving members of the Cetra, an ancient people who had a spiritual communion with the planet that Shinra has been trying to exploit for its own ends. Aerith knows more about what is happening to the world than she initially lets on. She goes with Cloud anyway. The party assembles as the story progresses. Tifa Lockhart, Cloud's childhood friend from the mountain town of Nibelheim, runs a bar in Midgar slums and has been part of Avalanche for years. Red 13 is a leonine, intelligent creature from a desert village, taken captive by Shinra's scientists for study. Sid Highwind is a pilot whose dream of becoming the first human in space was killed by Shinra's decision to cancel the space program rather than risk a launch. Yuffie Kisaragi is a teenage ninja from the Wutai Nation, a country that lost a war to Shinra and had its culture hollowed out as a result, who has been stealing materia from Shinra operatives and whose goal is to restore her homeland. Vincent Valentine is a former member of the Turks, Shinra's intelligence and enforcement branch, who had been a subject of the company's experiments and sealed himself in a coffin for 25 years as penance for the past. What unites them all eventually is Sephiroth. Sephiroth had been the greatest soldier Shinra ever produced, a silver-haired super soldier of apparently impossible capability who had been the face of Shinra's military dominance. He had been presumed dead for 5 years following an incident at Nibelheim. He has returned, and he is not what he was. The revelation of what Sephiroth has become and what drove him to it is one of the game's most carefully constructed narrative turns. Years before the game begins, Sephiroth had been investigating Shinra's Yenova project, the experiment that created him, and had uncovered what Shinra had been doing with an alien organism called Yenova, sealed in a tomb 2000 years before the game begins. What Sephiroth learned broke him. He came to believe that Jenova was his true mother, that he was not human, and that humanity was a plague on a planet that deserved something better, namely him ruling over its destruction and rebirth as a god. Cloud's connection to Sephiroth goes deeper than soldier service. Cloud had grown up in Nibelheim. Sephiroth had been assigned there on a mission. When Sephiroth discovered what he was and burned Nibelheim to the ground in his collapse into madness, Cloud, then an ordinary infantryman, not the soldier first class he claims to have been, had tried to stop him. Sephiroth wounded Cloud and left him. Scientists experimented on both Cloud and his best friend Zack Fair with Jenova cells. Zack died protecting Cloud, and in the drama of everything that followed, Cloud's mind constructed a false identity, absorbing Zack's stories, Zack's soldier rank, Zack's personality as a template for a self that Cloud no longer had access to. The game reveals this slowly, over dozens of hours, in fragments that don't fully resolve until the party finds Cloud in a near catatonic state at the bottom of a lake. Tifa, who had been there in Nibelheim for some of what happened and whose own memories are fragmentary, helps Cloud sort through what is real from what is false. Not because the distinction is easy. Memory, the game suggests, is as much construction as record, but because it matters. Cloud cannot fight for anyone until he knows who he actually is. The materia system governing Final Fantasy VII combat was built around this world's specific mythology. Materia, crystallized Mako energy, glowing orbs of compressed planetary power, could be slotted into the materia slots of weapons and armor. Magic materia allowed characters to cast elemental spells, healing magic, and status effects. Summon materia called enormous magical creatures, Ifrit, Shiva, Bahamut, and others, into battle. Command materia added special combat moves beyond the basic attack. Support materia modified other materia when slotted into linked pairs, casting a single target spell on all enemies, or countering physical attacks with a linked magical response. Because any character could equip any combination of materia, and because materia leveled up through accumulated battle experience and eventually created copies of themselves at base level, the system gave players complete flexibility. A party where every character was a dedicated healer was possible. A party where every character wielded summons exclusively was possible. The game made some combinations more strategically sensible than others, but it did not restrict the choice. Two players completing the same story would emerge with genuinely different parties shaped by what they'd chosen to develop. The ATB GOGs, inherited from Final Fantasy IV, filled in real time for all combatants simultaneously. 3 characters manageable in the heat of combat. The visual presentation of battles had changed dramatically from Final Fantasy's 4 relatively static perspectives. Final Fantasy VII battles used shifting camera angles and detailed character animations that made each attack visually distinct. The story's central villain plan. Sephiroth intends to summon Midgar, the game's ultimate destructive magic, to wound the planet and then absorb the planetary life force as it rushes to heal itself, ascending to godhood in the process. Gives the narrative stakes cosmic scale. The team pursuing him are not heroes in the classical sense. They are a mercenary, a terrorist cell, a flower seller, a traumatized test subject, a failed pilot, a vengeful teenager, and a man who has been in a coffin for a quarter century. They are people the world has chewed up, each of them shaped by the specific things Shinra's power has taken from them. At the City of the Ancients, an abandoned Cetra settlement of crystalline spires rising from a still lake, Aerith leaves the party while they sleep. She goes to an altar at the heart of the city and begins praying, attempting to summon Holy, the planet's supreme protective magic, to counter Meteor before Sephiroth can complete his plan. Sephiroth descends from above the altar and drives his sword through her from behind. Aerith collapses. Her hair ribbon unravels. The white materia containing Holy falls from her hand into the pool below. Cloud carries her body to the water and lays her to rest beneath the surface. The death of Aerith Gainsborough is, by general consensus, the most discussed, most emotionally significant single moment in the history of video game storytelling, Part of what made it devastating was structural. In most RPGs of that era, party members were resources to be managed and preserved, their value quantified in stats and equipment. Players had spent dozens of hours with Aerith, developing her materia, learning her limit breaks, hearing her talk to Cloud about the stars visible through cracks in Midgar's ceiling above the slums. She had been irreplaceable in the party composition many players built. She died in a cutscene. There was no fight, no mechanic, no way to prevent it. The medium's usual contract, that player agency determined narrative outcome, was suspended entirely. What replaced it was something video games almost never asked players to simply feel: grief without recourse. Aerith's prayer, it emerged, had worked. The planet had begun summoning Holy. Sephiroth had been suppressing it from the northern crater where he waited in the livestream. When the party finally defeated him, Cloud pursuing Sephiroth into the livestream itself for a final confrontation, Holy was released. It wasn't enough to stop Meteor alone. The planet's own livestream rose to push Meteor back, allowing Holy to destroy it. Final Fantasy VII launched in Japan on January 31st, 1997. In Japan, it sold 1.75 million copies on its first day. Within 2 days, 2 million. Within 3 days, 2.3 million, setting the record for the fastest selling game in history at the time. PlayStation consoles had sold out across Japan in the weeks before release due to anticipated demand. Famitsu gave it 38 out of 40 in its review score. The game had over 1.1 million pre-orders in Japan 10 days before release. The marketing campaign for Western territories was unlike anything the game industry had deployed before. Television commercials were story-driven, dramatic, airing during major sporting events to reach audiences who didn't buy games. Sony partnered with Pepsi for co-branded promotion. The game was positioned not as a genre product, but as an event. Something you needed to understand whether or not you played games. In North America and Europe, it made the RPG genre mainstream for the first time. Role-playing games had been a niche category in the West. Tactically demanding, narratively dense, rarely given mainstream distribution. Final Fantasy VII was the first main series game released in Europe. It sold approximately 9.8 million copies on the original PlayStation hardware, the platform's second best-selling game ever at the time. According to Gene Park of the Washington Post, Final Fantasy VII single-handedly put role-playing video games on the global map. For the Western generation that encountered it in 1997, it was often the first RPG they had ever played. Players who had never engaged with the genre at all found themselves 40 hours into a story about corporate environmental destruction, grief, the fragility of memory as identity, and what it means to fight for a world when your connection to it is built from someone else's history. Nobuo Uematsu's score, from the melancholy acoustic guitar of Aerith's theme to the relentless 9-minute orchestral escalation of One Winged Angel that accompanied Sephiroth's final transformation, become among the most recognizable music in any medium, performed in concert halls worldwide for decades afterward. Final Fantasy VII demonstrated that the Japanese role-playing game could achieve mainstream Western penetration with the right platform and the right marketing support. It validated CD-ROM over cartridges definitively, vindicating Square's decision to leave Nintendo in terms that were commercial and cultural simultaneously. It established that narrative complexity and emotional weight could sell tens of millions of copies. It created a generation of RPG players who had no prior relationship with the genre. It also created expectations for Square that would become its greatest pressure. Having produced the most commercially and culturally significant game in the company's history, Square was now expected to exceed it, with budgets, timescales, and production values that would only grow. The resources required to attempt that would define Square's choices in the years that followed, and eventually produce a crisis that cost the company's founder his position. But that is part 2. In 1987, a designer who was out of road sat down and made one last attempt. He built a game from 3 inspirations he admired, wrote himself and his company's desperation into its title, and shipped 520,000 copies in Japan, where he'd been prepared to ship 200,000. Over the following decade, the franchise that resulted asked different questions with every entry. Final Fantasy I asked who you wanted to be in a dying world. Final Fantasy II asked what rebellion cost in human lives. Final Fantasy III asked how many different ways a person might be effective. Final Fantasy IV asked whether a person who has done terrible things in service to authority can become worthy of the light. Final Fantasy V asked what it felt like to become whatever you chose. Final Fantasy VI asked whether there was any reason to fight after everything had already been destroyed. Final Fantasy VII asked what you owe a world that might not even have the same person you think you are living in it. 7 different answers, 7 different systems, 7 different worlds, 1 name. The name held because what it represented held. The promise that the next Final Fantasy would be its own complete work, fully realized, refusing to be a repetition of what came before. Final Fantasy VII sold 9.8 million copies on the PlayStation. It brought the genre to every continent. It made Eric Gainsborough's name known to people who couldn't have told you what a JRPG was. And it placed the man who had created the franchise, the one who had named it after his own desperation and turned the desperation into the most important RPG series in the world, at the helm of the most expensive animated film ever made. Whether that film could justify its cost is where part 2 begins. This is part 1 of the history of Final Fantasy.